Are you a professional pillow fighter? Or a 9-to-5 low-cost time travel agent? Or maybe real estate sales on Mars is your profession? It doesn't matter. Whatever it is you do, however complex or intricate, Monday.com can help you organize, orchestrate, and make it more efficient. Monday.com is the one centralized platform for everything work-related. And with Monday.com, work is just easier. Monday.com, for whatever you run. Go to Monday.com to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking to Dr. Max Fraser about his book titled Hillbilly Highway, The Trans-Appalachian Migration and the Making of the White Working Class, which takes us to a time and place that have had a pretty big impact on American politics, on American culture, on American all sorts of things. But despite the really quite substantial numbers that we're talking about, the time period that this covers, this migration within the United States, it's not really talked about or thought about. So I'm very pleased to do a tiny part of rectifying that by having Max here to tell us about the book. Thank you so much for being with us, Max.
Thanks so much for having me, Miranda. I'm really excited to be here and talking to you.
Likewise, could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and explain why you decided to write this book?
Sure. My name is Max Fraser. I'm an assistant professor in the history department at the University of Miami in South Florida. My work is really focused on American labor and working class history, and within that sort of broad field, my interests and research focus tends to be on white working class politics and culture in the United States in the 20th century, and particularly in the kind of post-war period. And, I chose to write this book, or I set out to write this book in part because of a way that you've already flagged for the listeners in your introduction, because this massive internal migration that I write about, which encompassed 8 million at least, and perhaps many more people who moved between the Appalachian South and the Upper South broadly and the industrial Midwest during the mid-20th century, has really hardly been written about. There's a very small extant literature on it, much smaller than, say, the literature that exists about the African-American Great Migration, the kind of parallel and simultaneous migration out of the Black South during these years, and likewise a literature about migrants from the southwestern, the Western Plains states to California and the Southwest during the mid-20th century. But very little had been written about this migration of overwhelmingly white, poor and working class rural Southerners who left Appalachia and moved to the Midwest during these years. And so that needed, I felt, or I thought it should be rectified by a deep and exhaustive study of that major demographic event. And it's one that seemed to me, and as I think the book sets out to argue, tells us a lot about a certain kind of white working class politics and culture during this period. and so in that sense, tried to fill in a gap in what we understand of white working class kind of politics, white working class political life, cultural identity, economic activity, labor activity during a critical period in American history during the mid-20th century.
Thank you for that introduction and background. I think it kind of sets us up nicely for what we're going to discuss to try and actually look at this properly, to make sure that we kind of know what all the words are, I suppose, and especially the ideas behind them. Can we talk about the title, Hillbilly Highway? What do you mean by those terms, hillbilly and hillbilly highway?
Yeah. Well, so I first encountered the term hillbilly highway. Well, first of all, I'll confess or celebrate. I'm a country music fan, one of the genres of music I like. And if you're a country music fan, you'll probably recognize that term from a handful or more than a handful of country music songs, and particularly one by Steve Earle off of his debut album. There's a song called Hillbilly Highway. And I knew that song before I started working on this project, but it was while I was working on this project doing archival work and especially oral historical work across the Upper South and the Midwest that so many of the people who I spoke to about this migration described it with this sort of colloquialism, this nickname, Hillbilly Highway, in an offhand way to refer to this, again, sort of massive population displacement that sort of moved millions of people back and forth between East Tennessee, the coal fields of West Virginia, or Eastern Kentucky, the mountains of Western North Carolina and elsewhere, and the major industrial towns and urban centers of the Midwest. And again, my sort of sources and others would refer in a kind of offhand way, oh yeah, my grandfather took the Hillbilly Highway, or yeah, I got that. We got on the Hillbilly Highway and went to Akron and relocated the family there. So the term as something which was quite widely circulated, discussed, known within this the population that I was writing about, had a very particular meaning, signified a very particular kind of experience, defined the contours of a very particular kind of social and cultural identity. And so I felt it was apt and appropriate to use that for the title. And hearkening back to that, my initial mention of the country music song, I also write a lot about country music in the book, in part because that genre and that form of vernacular culture was in many ways impacted by this migration, and we can talk about that more later. And I wanted to nod to the country music song also. So the term itself I use in part because it was one that was introduced to me from the mouths and the memories of the people whose life stories make up a critical foundation or spine, backbone of this book. Hillbilly, of course, I'll just talk about that term also separately because I know it's a fraught one. Of course, has a deep history in American life and American history as a pejorative term used to demean and speak ill of the rural white poor of largely the Southeast. I use the term advisedly in the book, consciously of the way it has been historically weaponized to marginalized and again to kind of demean a population group for its poverty typically, and for the way that poverty defined it as other from the mainstream of American cultural and economic life for so much of the 20th century. But I didn't want to avoid using the term in part because one of the stories that I tell in the book, one of the real through lines of the book, is the way in which this migration, this movement of millions and millions of poor, white, if I may use scare quotes in this moment, hillbillies out of the rural Southeast during these years into parts of the country like the urban Midwest where they were newly arrived, often had the consequence of reanimating, giving new life to that old slur, that old pejorative, and giving it new meaning and new content and weaponizing it anew in the political and cultural spaces in which this migrant working class moved during the 20th century. So I felt it was imperative to use that term because it continues to be used and reused and again reanimated over the time period and across the terrain of the migration. And so I try again to use it advisedly, to be clear how it's being used, when and why, to what end, often to what political and ideological ends. But it's a part of the story that I tell, so there was no way to tell that story without using it.
All right. In that one answer, you've explained the terms and given us a whole bunch of things that I want to ask you more about. So thank you for setting us up so nicely.
Sure.
I am not going to pick up on the country music one yet, though.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get back to it.
We'll get back to it because first, I think I want to start with that, I guess, more literal question before we get to like cultural impacts.
Sure.
What actually is the Hillbilly Highway? What is the material conditions, the economic development context that are combining such that we have this migration in the first place?
Yeah, of course, the brass tacks. Yeah, so when I use that term, what I'm referring to is a period of time between roughly the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, when 8 million or so, perhaps many more, residents of the upper South, primarily, a kind of broadly defined geography that you might think of stretching from the Carolina Piedmont in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, found themselves in increasingly economic precarious circumstances. And I'll return to what's driving that in a moment. And in response to that increasing economic precarity and drawn to the new kinds of economic opportunity that are sort of proliferating in the manufacturing belt in the American Midwest, in the cities, particularly around the Great Lakes, leave the region, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily. I'll return to this point too, and move north. And they move north again, primarily for economic reasons, to take better paying industrial jobs sort of in these manufacturing centers during those years. So again, about 8 million people, although quite possibly more than that. It's often really difficult to produce accurate tabulations of internal migrants who are not crossing national borders, and particularly migrants who are charting complex movements back and forth across a geography, the way these migrants often do. But roughly, let's say 8 million who move across that terrain during that period of time. That's the quote unquote Hillbilly Highway, or as the subtitle of the book calls it, the trans-Appalachian migration, this massive migration across a region that spans the Midwest and the Mid-South, which I refer to in the book as Trans-Appalachia. What sets them on the road at the beginning of the 20th century is a combination of economic factors, which makes life increasingly untenable for residents of the rural South who are land poor in one way or another, who have kind of precarious and increasingly tenuous claims to livelihoods tied in some way to the agrarian mixed economy of the rural Upper South, which had sort of been embedded there over previous generations, and who find themselves increasingly in need of subsidizing their livelihoods with waged work in the industrial economy. So farmers, particularly the more tenuously positioned farmers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, people whose control over land is already sort of, like I say, tenuous or precarious at best, find that precarity intensifying around the turn of the 20th century because of the rise of rural industry in the region, particularly resource extractive industry, lands being bought up by mining companies and logging enterprises that are taking the rural countryside and turning its natural resource bounty into a productive source of raw material for export to other parts of the country, but is taking land out of sort of the circulation and use by self-sustaining agrarian households of one kind or another. That increases the tenuousness of this population. In the 30s, during the Great Depression, a lot of state-driven modernization projects, think of the New Deal's Tennessee Valley Authority and others, are trying to alleviate some of the economic precarity that is observed in this region. But in doing so, they often intensify the sort of pressure on available land by taking land out of circulation in one way or another, by incentivizing the growth of mining and other kinds of industry in the region. They building big dams that require the relocation of thousands of households for flood control and dam construction and things. And all of these factors, agricultural modernization, the rise of new technologies in farming that increase the productivity and efficiency of farming, but in doing so displace farm labor in really significant ways. All of these factors, which again are sort of accelerating in the decades after the turn of the 20th century, combine over those sort of first decades of the 20th century to produce a massive rural surplus population, a population in the rural countryside of the South that just can't find a living within the region through traditional rural livelihoods. And they begin moving north into this, booming industrial economy of the Midwest, which has no limit to the amount of its need for raw labor power. And this population sort of becomes the surplus of the rural South, becomes the labor supply of the industrial Midwest as a result.
Good things come in threes, like my 3-row SUV.
Mom, Coach says 3
It gets my 3 kids to 3 sports in 3 different parts of town.
Mom, my new cleats are so
Luckily,
awesome.
I fill up with Synergy Supreme Plus premium gas from Exxon and Mobil stations. It keeps my engine 3 times cleaner for better gas mileage.
Mom, can we get ice cream after practice?
Because as soon as this season's over, the next one begins.
Find a station at Exxon.com. Synergy Supreme Plus gas compared to Synergy regular gas and port fuel injected engines. Benefits based on continuous use and may vary.
This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
Can we talk then about kind of what this does, right? You've set up the problem very clearly and why people would be driven to do this and kind of where the demand is. What happens socially as people are moving? What happens economically of this mass movement? What kind of happens next?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a kind of simple answer, a straightforward answer, then a more complex answer. And I try to delve into both in the book. The simple answer is that this is a kind of economic opportunity that millions of poor rural Southerners, there is no equivalent of in the rural South. I mean, as listeners knowledgeable about American economic history will know, the underdevelopment economically, and particularly industrially, of the rural South is a endemic problem throughout this period. There's very little of a kind of manufacturing base. Certainly the manufacturing base that exists is much lower wage than what exists in the more densely industrialized parts of the country, in the Northeast and the Midwest, and eventually in the far West. And so for people who get on the Hillbilly Highway and move north, more often than not, the immediate upshot is economic improvement. There's a sense in which this migratory experience is a familiar one of social and economic mobility, of upward mobility for millions of people who, who confronted with the economically deprived circumstances of the rural South leave home and move north during these years. But as scholars of migration know, simply acting out of pure economic rationality describes the behavior of very few actual living human migrants in any context, at any moment in history. And so to say what doesn't happen is that these millions of migrants don't simply, lock the door to the family farm, throw away the key, move north, and never look back. In fact, one of the most defining characteristic traits of this migration is that people are constantly moving back and forth, actually charting not a kind of unidirectional exodus from the rural South to the industrial Midwest during these years, but circuits back and forth in a whole variety of ways and permutations between old homes and new ones over the course of this period of time. The reason for that is because people are attached to their homes, to the where their families are, where the places that the communities that they identify with, the sort of regional cultures and ways of life that they've known growing up. And so in many instances, people, again, are migrating only temporarily. And so I'll tell stories in the book about, people who migrate much more like what we would think of in other contexts as like shuttle migrants, who move between the seasons. They retain their lives as farmers in the South, plant crops in the spring, move north during the summer, spend 3 or 4 months making factory wages at the Chevrolet plant in Flint, Michigan, and then go home in time for the harvest. Use the cash wages they've earned kind of to subsidize their livelihoods on the farm. Other people move for a period of years until they've set aside enough that they can go back south and finally buy a piece of land that they couldn't afford otherwise. Other people move north with the intention of working long enough to retire with a union pension and lifetime health insurance. And then the day they retire, after 30 years, going right back south again to where their home people are. And so the complexity of that, of the movements that people track across this geographic terrain that I call Trans-Appalachia really, again, is defining of the social and cultural experience, shapes and complicates the economic objectives and impact, you might say, of the migration, why and where people are going, where they end up, and how it impacts their economic standing or circumstances. And also in a way that I think, scholars of or who are familiar with the historiography and literature on the Great Migration of Black Southerners will recognize that this is really a critical difference between this migration of white Southerners as compared to Black Southerners during this period. And I try to unpack over the course of the whole book the significance of that difference. Black Southerners, because of the political and physical realities, dangers of Jim Crow and racial terrorism, the lynch mob, overwhelmingly leave the South and don't look back, or they look back, but they don't go back during through the 1960s and 70s until the passage of national civil rights legislation makes it more safer and politically feasible to return to the South. And so that the Black migration out of the South, the Great Migration, is much more of an exodus, right? And that term is much more traditionally applied to accounts of that migration. But this migration that I write about, because of the whiteness, because of what we might recognize as a kind of white skin privilege of the migrants I write about, people are able to move back and forth in all the different ways that I was referring to just now during the period of the migration. And it creates a different migratory dynamic and different cultural and social and political dynamics as well.
I'm really glad you emphasized that aspect of it, because it is different from the Great Migration, but also because it does have so many of these social and economic aspects that I think we're probably going to talk a bit more about.
Yeah.
But staying on this point for one more moment, I wanted to ask, did this sort of going back and forth, this almost circuit-like nature of it, do we see that change over the time period, or is this kind of a really consistent thing throughout the whole process?
Well, it's a challenging, that particular migratory dynamic was a challenging one to measure with any kind of statistical accuracy. And so the short answer is I can only answer it sort of anecdotally. You have to be a better scholar than I am, maybe, to have been able to discern or distill from the larger patterns the real sort of firm accounting of that. But here's what I'll say. There are ebbs and flows in the migration out of the Appalachian South over the course of that, 6 or 7 decades of the migration. World War I and the boom years of the 1920s is a first real peak of migration out of the region. Huge demand in Midwestern, the Midwestern manufacturing economy. These are the years when Northern employers really began actively recruiting poor white and Black Southerners to come north to work in factories. They're doing so in part because of the passage of national immigration restrictions in the mid-1920s in the aftermath of the Red Scare, right, which closes off the border, greatly limits the flow of cheap immigrant labor from Southern and Eastern Europe into the industrial heartland, and forces Northern employers to look elsewhere domestically for cheap and exploitable labor. And for a period of time, they look very intently to the South to provide that. So you see a real spike during those years. The economic calamity of the Great Depression slows things, migration out of the region. Factories are laying off rather than hiring workers during these years. And so millions of migrants, some Black, but especially white. Again, this is one of the things I was talking about before about how much easier it is for white Southerners to return to the South during these years, go back to the farm, participate in really a nationwide back to the farm movement as laid off industrial workers respond to the Depression by retreating to the farms they had left behind a decade earlier to try to weather the economic storm. So during moments like that, during the boom years of the 1920s, you see more, I'd say, long-term migration, people leaving, finding good jobs, imagining staying in those jobs for a kind of indefinite period, and perhaps starting new lives in the cities that they've ended up in. During the Great Depression, that seems much less viable. The industrial sort of city does not really seem like the sort of ideal setting in which to launch a new life. And so people are returning home in greater numbers in that period of time. There are other kind of smaller regional factors or changes, dynamics, which likewise impact what you might think of as the hydraulics of the migration, the flow in and out, back and forth across this geography at different periods of time. The mining industry in Southern Appalachia is a critical one. During the 20s, 30s, 40s, many poor farmers in the South can look to certain kinds of rural industry in the South for better pay greater economic opportunity, and they don't need to go north and work in an auto assembly plant to do that. They can go get a job at a mining camp in Harlan County or in a textile mill in the in North Carolina or something like that. But those jobs after World War II themselves begin to disappear pretty rapidly, in large part due to the mechanization of mining work, the rise of strip mining as opposed to deep shaft mining, which requires the labor of many fewer miners. And so the mine fields begin producing a whole next wave of migration out of the region during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Those migrants, once they're leaving the kind of bombed out, desolate moonscapes of the, kind of eastern Cumberlands and the Upper Cumberland Plateau, the Cumberland Mountains and West Virginia, there's very little for them to return to in those overworked mining communities. And so they leave and they kind of never look back, not because they're necessarily finding great opportunities always for economic advancement in the cities they end up in Cincinnati, Detroit, and elsewhere, but because there's really so little for them to return to. So I try to capture the kind of complexity of that as much as I can to attend to these micro shifts in the hydraulics of the migration, but it is such a complex regional dynamic that it's probably hard to oversimplify any more than I already have.
Well, I think that gives us a good general sense. And of course, this is a useful point to remind listeners that the book has loads more detail. So for anyone who wants to get further into that, there is literally a whole book on it.
Right.
I want to kind of keep going, though, with our highlights tour.
Sure.
And ask about kind of something you've mentioned a little bit already, the idea that these people coming out of Appalachia were considered a great labor solution to the factories. There was kind of never-ending demand for them. This, however, doesn't stay forever. You talk about this transition from Southerners being seen by factory employers as a great idea to then very much being sort of thorns in their sides. What's going on to change this?
Yeah. So, right. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, there's this real intentional, very ideologically grounded shift in the eyes or kind of corporate strategy, I guess is really the way to think about it, of Northern employers during the 1920s in response to national immigration restriction to recruit very intentionally poor Southerners to come work in Northern plants. And the rationale here is, on one hand, it's born of necessity. There's less access to immigrant labor, okay? But there's also, like I say, a real ideological argument that holds a lot of sway in the minds of and in the strategic thinking of personnel departments and amongst manufacturing executives during these years, that the white Southerner in particular, the poor white Southerner, will be the ideal, the most exploitable and docile source of labor. And it's what sort of piques their interest most about sending their labor agents into the countryside of Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama and West Virginia and elsewhere to go find these poor whites and bring them north. And the arguments that they make and they make it quite explicitly in the archive, or you can trace it in the archive, and I recount a lot of this in the book, is kind of threefold. Say, one, these people are so poor, right, that they'll work for whatever wages they're given, right? These hillbillies, right, that have always been the most marginal, most economically precarious sort of dregs of rural society. And so they'll take anything, right? So that's one argument. they'll work for anything we give them. And of course, what that really means is we can give them less, right, than we would give somebody else to work. So they're going to be cheap labor. They also think, the employers again, that these workers have had, these poor white Southerners have had very little experience with industrial labor, which is true, right? There's relatively little manufacturing employment in the Southern countryside, as I said a few moments ago. This is accurate. And as a result, this is, the sort of other side of that coin. They've had very little experience with industrial unionism. And for Northern employers who have just lived through the great post-World War I strike waves of 1919, this is a great appeal, one of the great appealing merits of the poor white Southerner, unlike those Eastern European Jews and Catholic immigrants and others who were so strike prone, who had brought with them from the old country these ideologies of socialism and anarchism and were spreading them amongst the factory workforces of the United States, or so manufacturers thought. These rural provincials, these hillbillies with no experience of industrial labor, of industrial unionism, of the language and rhetoric of industrial class conflict, will be kind of babes in the woods when it came to that kind of political life. And so therefore much less prone to take up with that line of thinking, or to bring that line of thinking, that kind of class ideology to the factories of the Midwest. And just to double down on that point, or that what made this population more docile, less likely to engage in political protest or class-based politics of one kind or another, Northern employers noted that these were white workers, and these were native-born and overwhelmingly Protestant residents of the South. And so as white native-born Protestants, these Southern hillbillies, so Northern employers thought, shared much more ethnically and culturally with their employers than they did with the more, the exploited other halves, right? Whether that is Black workers, immigrant workers, racial, ethnic, or religious minorities of one kind or another. And so that sort of cultural surety, or what manufacturers thought was a cultural surety, guaranteed that they would also, when the rubber hit the road, ally themselves, with the managerial class, with their employers, and not with this sort of the sort of polyglot, multi-ethnic industrial working class that had caused Northern employers so much so much trouble in the years around World War II, and indeed throughout the kind of Gilded Age and progressive period of great labor conflict in the Midwest. So that's the rationale for what becomes a major initiative to hire white Southerners, and many of the key kind of industrial enterprises of the interwar period, the auto assemblers, the rubber makers, tire makers, steel mills, others, go out of their way to hire white Southerners. There's reports of, GM or sending buses down to the boot heel of southern Missouri to bus up workers, just pick them up off the farm and bring them to the factory gates in Flint. Goodyear and Firestone and Goodrich, the three major American tire makers, who were all based in Akron, Ohio, the center of global rubber manufacturing during the 20s and 30s. They basically transformed their workforces into made up of almost entirely natives of Southern Appalachia, West Virginians, Kentuckians, Alabamans, Tennesseans, and others. For a period of time during the 20s and 30s, Akron is referred to colloquially as the capital of West Virginia, in part because so many West Virginians are hired by the rubber plants, again, for these reasons, for the reasons I've elaborated. But Akron itself then becomes a great example of how during the labor turmoil of the 1930s, during the great uprisings of the